Hello and welcome to the next panel here on CPDP. The topic today is civil engagement, a blueprint to build closer cooperation between business and civil society, organised by Privacy Surgeon. My name is Barry Guihen. I'm with the LSTS group here at the VUB in Brussels. And with me today, I have the chair, Nicolas Martin. Nicolas is a researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute for Innovation and Systems Research, and he's a political scientist by training, but his current research focus is on the implementation of the GDPR and of DPIAs, as well as on the effects of data protection regulation on innovation. Simon Davies, in the purple, is one of the earliest pioneers of the privacy movement. He's the founder of Privacy International, and he initiated the Civil Engagement Project, which you'll be hearing about today. At the very end of the table, we have Hielke Hijmans. He's an independent expert on EU data protection law, and he delivers services to the Centre for Information Policy Leadership, Considerati Amsterdam, and the Brussels Privacy Hub. He's also formerly of the EDPS. Right then in the centre, caught by the projector, is Michael Collyer. He works for several organisations, including Radically Open Security and Electronic Frontiers Australia. He holds his Bachelor's of Science in Politics, Psychology, Law and Economics from the University of Amsterdam. And then finally, right beside me, we have Annie Machon. She was an intelligence officer for the UK's MI5 in the 1990s, and she's now a writer, media commentator, and international public speaker. So as I said, today's topic is civil engagement and bringing various actors together on the issues of privacy and data protection. But to hear more on the topic today, I'm going to turn you over to our chair, Nicolas Martin, and he will introduce the topic, and then Simon will take off from there.
Thank you. Let's, okay, seems to work. So one of the things I found really interesting about this topic in this panel is that if you look at other areas of civil society activism, like environment or labor, you actually seem to have quite extensive histories of cooperation between civil society and an industry. There are things like various certification programs for everything from seafood to T-shirts to palm oil. You also, maybe more interestingly, see quite a bit of cooperation on regulatory issues. So, and I think the basic reason for that is that industry is often actually quite diverse and anything but homogeneous. So the interests between, say, the producer of an exhaust cleaning device or scrubbing device to install on a power plant is likely to have very different interests to the operator of said power plant, which enables space for alliances and cooperation between NGOs and industry. In the privacy space, however, to date, there seems to have been relatively little cooperation of either kind, either cooperation on regulatory issues and setting of regulatory standards, or on issues of industry governance, like certification or labels. And this panel is hoping to explore both the reasons for why there may to date have been relatively little such engagement and the potential that it offers. And with that, I'll turn over to Simon, who has been leading a study on the status quo and the potential for engagement between civil society and industry, who'll tell us a bit about the basic findings of that study. Short note, perhaps still on the modalities of this panel. So I think we'll maybe take the presentations first, and then afterwards I'll jump in with a couple of questions and open up to your questions.
I'll take, is this microphone working? I don't know whether you can pick it up on sound there. I hope so. I'll stand here so I can operate the screen. Okay, I echo those words completely. We launched the idea for this project at CPDP last year, and we had a number of assumptions. We thought there have been a few examples, but as you said, very few, where civil society, NGOs and activists actually can work with companies and with regulators. And where that has happened, it's been tremendously successful, and we, in the report, the interim report, we are giving some examples of that, and I've got several myself, one of which included Microsoft. I think this is working now. Microsoft reached out to me when they were about to launch Bing Street Side, and I said, you know, you've been criticizing Google Street View for years, but you haven't actually published your security standards. You haven't made Bing Street Side open source. And they suspended the global launch within 24 hours. And there have been many examples like that, but always with the usual suspects, like Microsoft, with Mozilla, and very occasionally with Google. So we knew that it's worked in the past. And talking about, for example, labor organizations, the environment and so on, we know that there are ways that we could improve, strengthen the trust. But the question is, what is the blueprint? What's the formulae that you would use? Now, the one thing we did discover when we, pardon me, getting over a cold here, when we discussed this last year here and at RightsCon, is that there are limits. There are times, for example, where trades unions will draw the line against employers. There are times when privacy organizations simply cannot abide the business model of some organizations, and there is no possible cooperation. It cannot be done. It's like anybody here who's tried to negotiate with national security agencies will understand that, and the same with police. You know, I think there's only been 2 occasions in my life where I've been able to cooperate with police at any meaningful level, and no occasions when it's possible with national security. It's very difficult with companies like Facebook, where there is a business model which is fundamentally opposed to privacy. So we started with those assumptions. A number of companies and NGOs supported a project, a 1-year-long project. And these are the questions we asked. They're quite straightforward. We needed to find out exactly what the barriers were and what the benefits were in cooperation. We needed that. And to do that, we needed to establish a methodology, conduct a lot of interviews and polling, and try and get to the bottom of why we have a problem. And we also needed to, you know, dig into the past. So, you see stage 1 here, we we have public dialogue like this, a background paper which talked a lot about issues such as cooperation in the environmental and peace movements. So Jörgen Johansson in Sweden did all that research. We conducted polls. We reached out to over 400 companies, got 176 anonymized responses on polls, and that was a surprisingly high proportion. Then conducted a number of interviews. We then have launched this interim, or we're about to, in the next week, launch this interim report. If anyone wants the current version of the interim report, just send an email to info@civilengagement.org, and we'll send you the PDF. But we're hoping a discussion here informs us when we do the final report, which we'll publish online at civilengagement.org. So, yeah, 402 industry players, 176 responses. Now, because it was a self-selecting sample, because obviously those who weren't interested weren't going to respond. So this is anything but an academic study. Even so, 72% of the companies that responded had absolutely no contact and had never had any contact with civil society. I did some leveraging of the figures and figured, you know, when you take into account those who refused to answer, it could be 90 and possibly as high as 98% of companies have never had any engagement at any level, not even at a conference like this. That's fairly poor, you know, when you compare it, for example, to the environmental sustainability movement. This is important, though. Lawyers and consultants tend to reach out more than companies. This is a big oversight. I didn't realize this, so we should now, in the next phase of the project, go to the consultants and the law firms and say, okay, what drives you? What do you expect when you speak to an NGO? And bearing in mind that companies are starting to realize that NGOs contain highly specific, valuable, independent knowledge that informs their policy and their technology. Microsoft's already understood this, and so has Google. Free advice, some people call it. And finally, there's been quite a number of conclusions, which you'll see in the report, but this is an important one. Companies overwhelmingly, and I think it's something like an 88% response on this, overwhelmingly only deal with civil society on a very specific issue. So that, for example, could mean, in the environmental parallel, water purification technology. But when it comes to anything else, you have to start the clock, the process all over again. There are very few companies that will have relationships that are long-term, sustainable, and flexible across a number of issues. So those are, that's a sort of snapshot of the findings. A lot of it is, you know, when you look back, in hindsight, a lot seems to be self-evident. It's not self-evident until, you know, you can get it away from intuition and into some sort of structure, some methodology. So now we know, at least to an extent, that there is a potential there, and most companies have agreed there is a theoretical potential for greater, stronger cooperation. There's a small number that said, you know what, we just don't trust civil society, we don't see how it's relevant, we don't have the time or the resources to reach out in this way, in which case somebody's not doing their job. But I'll leave it at that. Those are, as I say, they're the high-level conclusions. We will continue the work until probably the end of March, when we should produce a final report which will circulate through the industry and civil society networks. So that's the snapshot.
Okay. Well, many thanks for that. And then I'll hand over, first of all, to Annie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Simon, for that interesting report and the response that you've been getting to your attempts to get answers out of industry. I would suggest that privacy is probably the hardest sell when it comes to arguing for one of the fundamental human rights. And I say this advisedly because my working life started in one of the most privacy-resistant organisations, which was the UK Domestic Security Service, MI5. So I have seen from the inside quite what lengths these agencies are prepared to go to in order to get the information that they want. And this was way back in the 1990s, when it was the analogue era, and when they wanted to eviscerate you for your information, it was very labour-intensive. However, of course, we now know, with the internet and in the post-Snowden environment, that they can do that to all of us just at the flick of a switch. So the concept of privacy is becoming more and more remote. And of course, many companies as well have set up their very business model, as Simon mentioned, like Facebook, in, again, getting rid of the concept of privacy, in monetizing our data, in making sure that they can grab things like photographs of us and have us tagged, and then they can feed that information in to the intelligence agencies and allow the intelligence agencies through backdoors or through company complicity to then survey us all. I mean, there have been, just to alarm you slightly more, there have been talks about linking in the CCTV camera network in real time and accessing tagged photographs from Facebook to identify us in real time as we walk around the streets. Seriously. And then to try and write algorithms that could potentially analyze our behaviors, the way we walk, our gait, if we're loitering in a suspicious manner, and in real time, having identified us over the CCTV network, using information from companies like Facebook, then target us in case we might be about to commit a crime. That is the sort of society that we're moving into, and I find that frightening. But just to reel back very quickly, I was not only intelligence officer in the 1990s, I actually resigned and helped my partner at the time blow the whistle on a series of crimes. And because of this, we automatically faced prison. And because of that, we decided preemptively to go on the run around Europe to try and avoid that fate immediately. So we did an Edward Snowden, preemptively going on the run, but this was back in the 1990s, so it was a lot easier then. We didn't have CCTV. But I did learn some interesting lessons personally from that. And this goes back to my very first point about how do you sell the need for privacy? Why is it so damned important? And this was from the time when we were on the run and living in hiding and then living in exile in France, where we knew exactly what the spies could do to hunt us down, and we were at that time were high-value targets. So we knew that all our electronic communications would be bugged. We knew that any home we had would probably be bugged as well. And we were suspicious about, and in fact confirmed eventually, the fact that some of our friends had been pressured and turned to report back on us. So we spent a number of years living without any concept of privacy in our daily lives. And this is up to and including in your bedroom. So think about it. It's not nice. And you start to self-censor. You can't even have a gossip with your mother over the telephone because you know that they will be listening. So you start to self-censor. And this is something that we have noticed, particularly since Edward Snowden exposed the sheer scale of the spy apparatus these days. We notice that there is something called the Snowden Effect, where people are indeed beginning to self-censor their activity over the internet. I think it's about 30% of adults in the UK, in the immediate aftermath of Snowden's disclosures, actually said, yes, now they're beginning to be careful about what they watch, what they write, who they link to, perhaps planning their political activism or whatever. So from a personal point of view, I know quite how corrosive it is to the human spirit to feel you have no privacy. But from the political and societal point of view, if more of us are feeling like that in our activities online, in our activities and our communications, then that is very damaging to the very notion of democracy. Because if you do self-censor, you cannot activate, you cannot plan, you can't have relationships or whatever on the internet, then you cannot be fully informed and fully participatory citizens in a democracy. And that is the start of the end of democracy. So I find when I'm advocating the need for privacy, this is quite a useful line to use. The other one, though, as well, just to finish with, is the concept of how increasingly we are going to become more and more dependent on electronic communications, on the internet. I mean, we all live our lives increasingly online, be it for banking or health or shopping or long-distance relationships or whatever it is. And this will only evolve increasingly quickly to a point where, potentially, in a few decades, we might be able to upload our consciousness onto the digital realm. Now, think about it. If we were to get to that point, wow, we could live forever. But who is going to own that consciousness? Who's going to own the storage which holds our consciousness? Who would be able to play with it or manipulate it or whatever? And so if you take this sort of reductio ad absurdum type argument that eventually we might get to that point, who do you want to control it? Do you want the government having automatic access? Do you want corporations to own you? We are sort of getting there already, I would suggest, in terms of the technology we use today. So just getting people to think forward, I think, could be quite a useful way to get them to really understand the fundamental value of privacy. And let's, of course, you all know, but let's remind ourselves That right was enshrined in the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights for a very good damn reason in the aftermath of World War II. Because if we can't have privacy, as I said before, we cannot have a fully functioning democracy, and we cannot be fully realised as independent and sentient beings individually as well. So this is such a very powerful fight, and it's so very difficult to try and get organisations, to get companies, even to get individuals to understand why it's so damned important. But I would suggest that the concept of having lived with no privacy was startlingly bad for me. The concept of a society having no privacy now, we're already seeing the impacts post-Snowden. And we need to look forward to what technology could then imply for our future privacy as well. And that is a way perhaps of engaging a little bit more, particularly with corporations, and moving away from the corporations whose business model is indeed just to strip us of privacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, I think I'll hand over right away to Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So what I want to talk about a bit is, the way forward, the way that places such as the CPDP are an excellent environment to improve cooperation between corporations and civil society. Because you mentioned earlier that the environmental scene is there's a lot more development going on there, and not so much within the privacy scene. And I think that's kind of due to the kind of abstract nature of privacy. It's not as tangible as going outside and seeing the trees, seeing nature. So I think because it's not as tangible and people, have an abstract view of it, it's a lot harder for them to fully understand it and assign a value then to it. And the way kind of that we're moving forward, such Annie, as you said, with the technological developments, I also believe because these tech developments are increasingly happening faster and faster, the waters get a bit muddy, and in the future, I think we're going extremely fast, and without including everyone in the discussion, we'll kind of fork off and kind of have two different ideas of what privacy is or what our value of data should be. So that brings me back to kind of what I wanted to touch upon, the value of conferences and actually meeting and initiating events. Because the way I see it is you used to have conference halls where it was only business or only academic conferences, and now we're kind of seeing a merging of these two, where you can sit in here, have an academic, somewhat academic and business discussion, and then go outside and see all the stalls and the businesses, and I think that dynamic plays well on each other. And then other things such as, globalization, the reduced cost of travel, make it a lot more feasible for everyone to come together and have these discussions. Well, today we're talking about, in the report we talk about building trust and how can we build trust, and I think there's sometimes a misconception of trust should come in entirety. It's 100% you have to trust everything at once. But it isn't the case that you have to, once you trust someone, give them your entire life story, but you build that trust over incremental steps. So for example, coming here and then talking to business or civil society, which one you are, is just a step in the right direction. Even if it's an increase of trust of 1%, that's at least one step in the right direction. Because trust doesn't come, it's not evidence. It has to be earned. I think some of what you said earlier in your presentation about the expectations of corporations, of business, and what they expect from civil society and vice versa. I think this management of expectation is very important to build the trust, so that people perhaps under-promise but then over-deliver regarding the data or the project that they're currently working on. With that being said, I think the way forward is definitely just getting the debate opened and trying to use concrete examples, trying to make it more tangible for people that don't necessarily work in the privacy field, and showing them why privacy matters, especially given that we're living in the internet era and that the tech developments are increasingly at an ever faster rate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll go to our final panelist, Hielke.
Thank you. It was good in this panel, Annie, to get a real reminder how important privacy is. I will not repeat that. I found it very good to hear that. I'm a scholar in this area, so I wrote a book on privacy and data protection in the European Union, starting with more or less the same story as you told, but then based on the story of Glenn Greenwald, which was for me the inspiration to think how privacy can be important. But I'm just a scholar, so I cannot say much about my real life experience. Nevertheless, I would find this a nice start. Apart from that, we talk about civil engagement, about engagement of civil society. And there is an issue there, of course. It is small until now, apparently, I think, especially compared to environmental issues, for instance. I think it's small. But there are all good reasons to make this bigger and to make this more important. I'm here asked probably because part of my work, I work for the Center for Information Policy Leadership, which is a think tank which has as members of quite a few big companies. So the idea of engagement is quite important for that. I think there are good reasons for better engagement between civil society, data protection authorities and companies. And I hope that I read the underlying report by Simon Davies, at least part of it. It has a sort of negative undertone. I hope we can make this change and have engagement much better. I think the GDPR has a lot of incentives to operate as a game changer and to improve better cooperation, better engagement of all parties involved in privacy and data protection. And for me, the main issue in this respect is basically accountability. Article 24 of the GDPR. It requires organizations to be accountable. That's the core of what we talk about in GDPR. And accountability goes beyond just being compliant with the law. It also requires to think how to best deliver privacy data protection. How can you best deliver privacy and data protection? By talking to those who are most involved in it, who are most interested in it. And those are also definitely privacy organizations. So I think there's a good reason for even because it's required by the law, for accountable organizations to get in touch, to take the initiative, to be engaged, to become engaged with organizations. Accountability as a starting point. It means, in the first place, transparency of what you're doing. Accountability is about transparency. It also is about possible constructive engagement with all stakeholders. As CIPL, we wrote a paper mainly on engagement between companies and DPAs, data protection authorities, but there's no reason why this engagement, constructive engagement, talking together, sitting together in good ways, why that should be limited to the relationship between DPAs and companies and not should extend to civil society as well. I think that should be the thing. And I think it is important for accountable organizations to understand the concerns of citizens. The report of Simon mentions, for instance, institutional arrangements that could help to have better engagement. Multi-stakeholder meetings, you can think of. Codes of conduct in the GDPR could be a way. The codes of conduct could be an excellent method to ensure or to improve structural input by NGOs. But there's more of it. If you look at the GDPR, at the task of the DPAs, for instance, one of the tasks is awareness raising. Awareness raising is something which is in everyone's interest of the companies, of governments, as processors, controllers of personal data, DPAs, and definitely of civil society. So I think awareness raising is something that could be very well done together. I talked a little bit before this with Google, one of the companies mentioned before, and always mentioned in this conference for all kinds of reasons, but they really wish to work together with NGOs on privacy campaigns, at least that's what they told me. There's also other things which could be done, engaged. Mechanisms, for instance, for the effective exercise of the rights of data subjects, right of access, right to be forgotten, portability. It's good to work together in this area, and it's also good if companies ensure that through giving access, through making the exercise of rights more easy, that can lead to engagement. And NGOs can definitely help in developing better mechanisms, better and more helpful mechanisms to do this together. Another thing where organizations could be helped by NGOs could be, for instance, complaint handling. Complaint handling is an important issue, is very difficult, but it's something, if you do that together, if you open up ways of dealing with complaints, especially when it's more massive complaints, I think that's something that could be very well been done together by civil society, DPAs and organizations. In that way we have also added value that DPAs are not swamped in just complaint handling, but can do other things as well. It could facilitate. Increasing awareness of individuals of privacy issues, that's what we face now, and the GDPR, I think that will lead to much more private enforcement of data protection law and a bigger role of privacy organizations. That's also what the GDPR envisages, where it allows privacy organizations to engage in complaints to DPAs, but also to start start lawsuits, for instance. There's a lot of possibility in the GDPR which allows, which gives incentives for further engagement of civil society, of private enforcement of data protection law, and I think that's very helpful that we don't leave everything with DPAs. A final point which I would like to make is that constructive engagement between various stakeholders, in my view, can also get good way to overcome differences and find solutions without going to court, without having time-consuming, money-consuming court proceedings. There are ways to deliver privacy together and to have engagement together. So my speech is mainly a plea for sitting together and to think better together how to do this. I must admit that my background where I work for at the moment is mainly bigger companies, so I don't have the problems which you face with SMEs, but I think the same problems are similar for different kinds of organizations. Thanks.
Okay, many thanks to all the panelists. To start the discussion, I'd like to take sort of riff of what Hielke was saying and ask the other panelists if you could maybe comment on that or comment on the question, what do you see as the most important value add of closer engagement between civil society and industry, and what do you see as the most promising issues around which such cooperation could be built? Hielke mentioned a number: accountability, codes of conduct, awareness raising, complaint handling. Do you see those also as the most promising, or do you think of others, or maybe you disagree that they would be particularly useful? Simon, do you want to start?
Okay. Well, the surveys and the polling do actually give us a bit of an insight into this. From my perspective, as an activist and as an academic, my experience is that it's not all of those. It's all of the things you've both mentioned, all of those elements, but there's so much more. I think if you talk to 10 different companies, you'll get 10 completely different responses as to what is, the most valuable outcome. For some, it's the avoidance of bad news. bad PR, and for others it's avoidance of legal costs associated with a case. And it's really difficult to kind of find a common thread. Most companies are saying, look, the most valuable, like a lot of companies are saying, for us the most valuable reason for constructive engagement is that we're able to assess the full range of views and perspectives and advice. We can assess it, and that means that we can go to our stakeholders and we can say we have consulted. From the NGOs, of course, that's what they fear. They don't want to be brought into some sort of messaging exercise between, you know, the corporate entities. So everybody's concerned about manipulation of a relationship, rather than being concerned about that not engaging actually does create a negative effect. So I would say, in summary, what's the best outcome? I would say the best outcome is that it opens up possibilities that are yet unforeseen, that one positive engagement between a company and an NGO will cause that company, in its own chain of command, to ask, is there another thing that we're missing here, another element of engagement we could possibly pursue? As I say, with companies like Google and Microsoft, you're seeing that chain reaction of thought. So finally, in the companies that have thought about this, civil engagement and NGO engagement actually forms part of the dialogue internally on every major current or prospective issue. And what we've got to do is elevate that so across the entire corporate spectrum. And I say this also applies to NGOs. They've got to start thinking about this and stop being so isolationist, many of them. And certainly, we've got to start reaching to the SMEs. You mentioned the SMEs. Honestly, there's so little engagement by small and medium-sized companies, and they're very difficult to reach. But that's where a lot of the engagement needs to be taking place. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Yep.
Thank you. Shall we go with Michael?
So if I understand your question correctly, it was first, who benefits the most from...
Not necessarily who benefits the most, but what would be what would be the total value add? What would be the total benefit? Whether for an individual player or for society at large?
Well, I think first and foremost, main person that is benefiting to start would be the end user of either civil society or business, that being the consumer or the citizen, all of us included. And then that kind of as the main part of it then adds up on top of the benefits for businesses. Once the citizen becomes more aware of their privacy issues and the value of their personal data, that they will transition over to more of these kind of privacy conscious organizations and businesses. So I think there's also incentive for them to already kind of be ahead of the bandwagon and already take these first steps. And then to the second question of whether or not accountability or transparency or raising awareness, which of these are the most important, if any. I would then say accountability is probably the number one, for the main reason that, for example, if you look at then transparency, maybe people know what's going on, but without maybe a legal basis and the possibility to hold those organizations accountable, you can know that they're messing with your data, but unless you can maybe take them to courts or actually have accountability for then your privacy and data regulation protection, then there's not a lot of standing. So I think accountability is probably the number one for me.
Okay. Thank you.
No, I would concur with Michael, absolutely. One of the things we saw with the Snowden Effect back in 2013 was very red faces, very red corporate faces in Silicon Valley, particularly companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft, because they'd all been exposed as being backdoored, should we say, or possibly complicit, working with the NSA and the other intelligence agencies. So I think there was a sort of scramble after that immediately by some of these companies because they saw privacy as being important. So they started saying, oh, no, we're not doing that. We're going to build in end-to-end encryption. And it was a sort of PR payoff where they could say, well, we'll guarantee your privacy, come and use our products. So that was the big plus for them. But I think the general sense I get is that more and more companies are waking up to this sort of approach, that privacy is something that sells, that privacy is something that consumers will buy. And I think that's a tipping point that perhaps we as advocates for privacy should be using a little bit more. Like I said in my talk, the concept of privacy is one of the hardest sells I ever find, and I campaign on a whole range of different issues, but getting people to understand why it's so fundamentally important is the difficult thing. And Snowden was a wake-up call, both for us, we the consumers, and also the companies. So more of that, please.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to hand over to the audience, or open the discussion up to the audience and your questions. Please. I'm not sure, do we have another microphone? Or?
I don't think so. Ivan, oh, you have one? No, that's okay. I'm from, let's say, the Central European University, in short, from Hungary. A question to Simon and to all of you, maybe. How would you prevent NGOs from being used for simply legitimizing decisions which are otherwise absolutely incompatible with their values? Because there exists a usual strategy or tactics from big companies. You set up a commission or a committee, you invite one or two representatives of the civil sector, and even if there would be a voting on certain questions, your opinion would be pushed away, but your mere presence in such bodies and the way you establish contact with the companies legitimizes the decision. So how would you avoid such a situation in practice? What would you suggest to benevolent civil participants? That's a question.
Thanks for that, Ivan. We had a lot of discussion about this. And it is actually the primary concern of civil society. I won't say the only one, but it's right up at the top, is this capture, reputational capture. And this is exactly what the corporations report too. It's that fear of your engagement being manipulated for the benefit of the other party. And this, of course, applies not just in privacy and data protection, but across the entire realm of political and human rights. There is no short way around this because we're caught in a chicken and egg situation. You have to build trust before there is disclosure, before there is non-disclosure, before there is an understanding that your good name will not be manipulated. We've seen and documented a number of examples where NGOs in good faith, perhaps naively, have gone into, let's say, a workshop organised by a corporation and found that their names had been used in the annual report to justify that engagement. And of course, this is the last thing you want as an NGO. I believe one way around this is to start the trust process with Chatham House rules. And with Chatham House rules, you have an agreement that it doesn't matter whether it's just internal communications, but internal, external, anything, you will not be named. There will not be any indication of your sanctioning or being involved with that company unless there is a joint agreement that it works. So you start cautiously. Chatham House rules are there for a reason, with an understanding that there can be further dialogue to actually create a more public-facing relationship. So that two-stage process, I would recommend to any NGO, and in fact any company, and it leaves the door open. That's important. Have the door open for a better relationship in the future.
Can I add something? I have nothing to add, basically, to what Simon says, because I think this is the core, how to build trust, and I think you also in politics, you build trust by first sitting together without too many people watching you. On the other hand, that's exactly you also need transparency and you need to be clear. My main point, what I want to make, is that I don't like so much the question of Ivan. Why not? Because I think if you take this as a starting point that you're being instrumentalized or you're being used, then in the end you will not start in building something. You're just starting from a negative point of view. Of course you must always be careful. Of course you must not be naive. But I think the starting point should not be the risk of being instrumentalized. The starting point should be the common intention, the common incentive, the common ambition you have to deliver something more, to deliver better privacy, for instance. And I hope maybe that sounds naive, but that's how I would like to approach things. From the idea that engaging is in itself a constructive activity. And of course not always until the end, but this is the basis of engagement.
Thank you. That's very nice. I have another question, I think, although it relates, and I'm curious if something in the report might answer my question.
Excuse me, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, yes. I'm Aviva de Groot. I'm with the Tilburg Institute of Law and Technology and Society. Ms. Machon, I think your story showed very well that your deep technical awareness and awareness of the operational possibilities of MI5 added to the chilling effect that you were experiencing, and Snowden showed the same thing. I was wondering, because I think a call for transparency for this reason is very important from civil society. Did avoidance of this deeper awareness of technical and operational possibilities, this surface as a reason for industry not to engage with civil society?
I can actually provide okay, so the report actually talks about the transparency issue and some of the pitfalls in not engaging for greater transparency and some of the benefits of engaging. So, for example, there's one anecdote we put here, which is transparency reports. So you'll be aware that a lot of major companies now publish every 6 months, sometimes, a report that analyzes all of the government access requests to personal information. Now, a number of civil society organizations agreed to meet with Google. We were all at war with Google. You remember this is about 10 years ago. They were bitter enemies. We'd never spoken. But this was pre-Snowden, and so we talk in the report about the chronology of what happened. There'd been a lot of bad press about information being leaked to government or given to government by corporations. We spoke to Google and said, listen, wouldn't it be great to have something called a transparency report where you actually went public? I remember talking to Microsoft about this too, and they were seriously thinking about it until Google did it, then they really had to do it. But Google actually, for the first time, even though we had them in court in 10 different countries, we were hauling them through the headlines of the newspapers, they were able to separate that, and they said, okay, let's just work together. Let's create the first transparency report and see. That means it looks good for us because we can explain why we have to give information to government, to the police, to security. And so they did that, and they did it in full cooperation. And we were happy, they were happy. Well, we weren't happy. We wish they'd give more information, but we kind of got an understanding of the important internal dynamics in a big corporation. They're not easy. A big corporation is like, well, it's like Brussels. There's like 50 villages. And that's like a corporation. There is no one controlling mind. So you take what you get, you work on trust, and we've ended up now with a chain reaction where, frankly, companies that don't produce a transparency report are viewed as bad players. And that, I think, was a real clear win, and it plays to what all of us have been talking about, this transparency and accountability and engagement theme.
Thank you. Yeah. You can speak from behind if you trust your voice.
Hello, I'm Danny Guihen, working for Premadatum, a 10-year-old startup focusing on privacy and building on privacy. So we're also engaging with civil society. And I want to ask, in your data, for instance, in the report, if you see a difference between companies which build upon the use of data, which is a business model emerged in the last 20 years, let's say, and other newer companies which build more on privacy-enhancing technology business models. Do you see that emerging?
Let's have this one. Okay, so the data doesn't, because we had to anonymize the data. Almost every company said, we're not going to. That wasn't really a good start, was it, for this report? They said, we don't want to be named. So everything had to be anonymous. So, but we can get a few ideas. What we did find out is that the B2B companies, business companies, don't really engage. The B2C companies do, but the greatest proportion of those companies that do engage with civil society and do have a relationship, some crazy figure like 80, I haven't got it to hand here, but 80% are in the business of sensitive personal data. So, for example, you're looking at those platforms like, cloud services are a good example. So those, we do know that banks are an aberration. Banks almost never talk to NGOs, ever. One of them said here, I've just got a quote here from one of the retail banks, I think your view of NGOs is a little overinflated. Yeah, I mean, that was fairly, and they said, look, we've got 100 regulators and stakeholders to deal with, we can't do this. So banks, retail organizations only deal, as a rule, with consumer groups and environmental groups, never with privacy groups. We find that even companies, because we did some interviews, right? So even companies involved in developing privacy technologies don't really engage NGOs. The new startups, their interaction is roughly the same level as the SME interaction, that we found extraordinary. So you're in the business of creating a privacy platform, a security platform, and you don't engage. You don't actually ask the people who you need the support from publicly. You don't actually bring them in as a partner beforehand so you can work with them. And we never really understood that. I mean, I'm not saying that's everybody, but 9 out of 10 organizations in the business of privacy still don't talk. And then they come, and you have this crazy situation where you get these random email, random, I'm getting about 10 a day. Oh, we've created this new privacy VPN. The best privacy VPN in the world. I said, well, I've never heard of it. Nobody I know was involved with it. And now you want us to give you a free audit or something? So there's a lost opportunity there. So yeah, so that's a long answer, but we're not seeing any difference between those involved, for example, in privacy-enhancing technology development and those who are involved in deploying, highly sensitive data platforms. There's almost no difference in the extent to which they engage civil society. That's got to change.
If you just come around then to this side, it makes it a bit easier. Yes, it is a bit. It's also a little bit loose.
Maybe we should just try doing this by pure voice power.
No, but then the recording doesn't work.
This works.
This is very sensitive. My name is Corrie Ebbers. I work as a privacy lawyer now since 1996. And I work for the local government in the public sector, and I have a worry. I saw a lot of legislation passing by, intrusive legislation. I saw a lot of cameras being placed in cities, and I never have had the experience that there was an evaluation, so the legislation is withdrawn, or the cameras disappear. And also our DPA and a lot of NGOs, or maybe not the NGOs, but the DPA, is when the legislation passes, and they are asked for advice, they say, okay, we made this. Anyway, I need some hope. Does any of you can give me some hope? When will only one camera disappear, or when will law disappear? For example, after 9/11, there was a lot of very intrusive law, and when will there be an evaluation so that we all can decide, several parties, okay, this is not necessary. It proved not to be necessary, so we take a step back. I know it's a very big question, but after so many years, I'm getting a bit, well, not depressed is too strong, but a bit negative about the subject privacy.
So I'll try holding. Annie, if you want.
Do you want to put it in here? It might be easier. Okay, let's see if is this working. Yes, it is. Obviously, I follow a lot of this new legislation very closely, and obviously I'm British, and we have some of the most draconian legislation around surveillance in any Western notional democracy. Yeah, we are the CCTV central of the whole world, I think. They estimate if you just walk around London about your daily business, you'll get photographed at least 500 times. So tag that in with Facebook recognition. It's difficult to stay under the radar. I'm afraid I can't give you hope. All these laws have come in, particularly, as you said, post 9/11, to counter this war on terror. And one thing I've seen from both the inside and from the whistleblowing side is that once the powers that be have new powers, it's virtually impossible to wrestle those powers out of their hands. So, for example, at the beginning of last year, a nasty law came in place, which is the Investigatory Powers Act, otherwise known as the Snoopers Charter. And this was a sort of zombie law that kept getting suppressed and kept getting rejected. And then suddenly, somehow, it got passed in the teeth of massive opposition from all sorts of NGOs who were giving reports to the Parliament as this law was going through, from all sorts of whistleblowers who actually gave reports to Parliament and all the parliamentary committee hearings, including myself, saying that this is disproportionate in a democracy, there's no proper oversight. Effectively, what you're doing is legalising what the spy agencies have been doing illegally for the previous 16 years, tacitly admitting that. And this bloody law still passed and is now in place. So we have this Snoopers Charter, and we're never going to get rid of it. If any new law comes in, every time a new law like this comes in, it gets worse. So in terms of hope, I'm afraid I can't hold out much hope when it comes to privacy. On the legal front, what I do suggest is if we cannot guarantee that the spy agencies work within the law, and we can't, and if we can't guarantee that our governments can introduce better laws to protect us, and we can't, then we need to take the responsibility for our own privacy into our own hands as citizens. And that's where things like crypto parties come in, where you can take your laptop and get it fixed up with all sorts of open source programs and software that will actually protect your privacy. But that requires an awareness already on the part of the citizen that they need to do it and why. And that's precisely what I try and advocate around, yeah. Yeah, it's both. I mean, we are society. And if we don't take that control back into our own hands, we don't have a hope, I don't think. So, yeah, crypto parties wear it out.
I maybe could introduce some hope. I mean, I will say it's not hope and privacy don't tend to sort of, you don't hear them in the same sentence. But, I mean, it is true. I mean, Britain, for example, has got probably more CCTV cameras than people now. And I remember I ran the first campaign against CCTV in the world, actually, going so far back. And it didn't matter what we did, more of these cameras were installed until finally there were probably at the time a couple of million of them. We're talking 20 years ago. And then criminologists started to get involved. So people like Jason Ditton and Strathclyde and a whole bunch of other criminologists started to actually report on the evidence, if there was any, that the cameras work. And the evidence was damning. I mean, there was, the cameras just basically, they displaced crime, okay? They didn't really do anything. And so based on this evidence, and even this assessment, and even the assessment of the Home Office itself, we confronted the Home Secretary, and he said, on camera, in a TV program, he said, well, he said, it doesn't really matter. It's what makes people feel good. If it makes them feel safer, then we've done a good job with this technology. Now, okay, scroll forward 6 months, right? So they invest billions in this technology that doesn't work. But it's great for mass media. Mass media get free footage. I was invited in the 1990s to a workshop in Kiel in Germany with the attorney generals of several Länder, and they were talking about whether CCTV should be allowed in Germany. Now, in a complete contrast to the UK, after I presented all the criminological evidence, two of the attorney generals came up to me and said, there is no chance we are going to allow this. Now, that didn't last, okay? A few years later, cameras started to appear, but nevertheless, we stalled it. But what I say, and this is my message of hope, is at a societal level, there's a lot we're doing at the individual level. There are countless examples where the evidence base, the evidence test, has stopped the introduction of legislation. In Canada, for example, in the United States, when I was invited to chair an FTC conference on identity, on identity cards, and we produced a lot of evidence about the failure of identity cards, and we've not seen that proposal. We see it every 5 years, but it was killed stone dead in the White House as soon as the evidence was presented. So I think we've got to focus, all of us, on the evidence-based approach. And lawmakers, they all have their pet projects. They don't want billions going into something that's not going to work. They want it for their project that doesn't work. So yes, I would say, I would probably be able to give you 100 examples of laws that did not go through because that is the sensible adult approach that was taken. And I think we can continue to do that. You know? So yeah, there is some hope.
And I add a few things on that. I've had the honor to work for years in this area when I worked at the European Data Protection Supervisor. We also saw a number of laws which we were critical about, based on evidence, which never made it through. On the other hand, this battle between privacy and security, what we talk about now, that's a bit a different battle than the battle we talked about when we talked about Google and Facebook, etc. But this battle is in the end, it's difficult to win, because in the end of the day, the idea that you make a country safer by putting more CCTV cameras is very difficult to argue. But there are good arguments why sometimes arguing this works. I think evidence is an important issue. That's what Simon already mentioned. I think money is an important issue. When I talked to police people, for instance, quite often people high up in police areas, they feel that they don't want to have these enormous databases, etc., because they simply cannot manage it. It costs a lot of money, and it's not very effective all the time. I recently saw a tweet, an input on LinkedIn by Rob Wainwright, until very recently the director of Europol in The Hague, who said that he was actually quite happy with the strong rules on data protection within Europol, for reasons that it made him understand the data they're using, be much more efficient with data, etc. So there are some ways in which you can be really efficient, and the evidence story is a good one. And last point I think I would like to make is that we have a Court of Justice in the European Union. And if you look at what the parameters the European Court of Justice set in this area, in cases like Digital Rights Ireland, recently in the opinion on Canada PNR, there are quite strong requirements on these laws. So the requirements for lawmakers are there under European law, under European human rights law. And if we use that, then not everything is possible. So there is hope. It's not so negative.
Do we have time for one question still? Is there one question still? Otherwise, I'll have a final question to the panel. Okay, so my final question is, Simon earlier mentioned companies rarely have a single mind. They're quite fragmented organizations. And in some ways, the same applies to the NGO world. In Germany, I can think of at least 6 or 7 NGOs working in the privacy field. So the question is, if industry wants to engage with civil society, who should they actually engage with? And the reverse in the same way. When civil society wants to engage with a company, who in the company or around the company should they actually try to contact, to engage with? Is this about the developers who are making new devices? Is this about the privacy professionals in the company? Is this about maybe professional associations outside of the company itself, like the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or various industry bodies? And I wonder if members of the panel might say something to that, especially, of course, Simon, but also others.
I can say one of the recommendations answers this in 10 words. Well, actually 4 words. We need a clearinghouse. And you mentioned IAPP, as it represents 14,000 privacy professionals. That's a good start, and I've already had discussions with them. We do need a central clearinghouse which is accessible to all organizations from both sides and to regulators. And if you're not on that list, let's say Apple decides it doesn't want anything to do with this, well, it will be very clear to people where its priorities lie. So there is a real incentive, there's a carrot and stick here by having a clearinghouse, and this, I think, is going to end up the primary recommendation of this report. And we make it very clear to all the groups, show your willingness, get on this list, and you decide who is a good contact person who can, whenever any issue arises, can steer an inquirer to the right person. So, yeah, that's one of the things we're really going to push very hard for.
And it sounds as if that was the last comment, so then I don't want to keep you from lunch unless there are any further questions. Thanks a lot to our panel, to Simon Davies in particular, and of course to our host and the audience.